So Martin Lucas, thank you so much for joining me today as another fantastic expert joining our Great Mental Fitness interview series. Now, Martin has got a really, really interesting career from my perspective. He's the CEO and founder of Gap in the Matrix, and he spent something like 4 years of his life really seriously studying and understanding behavioral psychology and mathematics and applying that into the business world. So Martin's going to have some interesting context to share there. And I know that Martin's also very passionate about nurturing and maintaining great mental health in ourselves and everyone around us. So Martin, thank you very much for joining us. Please tell us a bit more about yourself and your background.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I spent 4 years, I gave up a business that I had, I sold an investment property that I had. I felt that there was a huge gap in the market in terms of how people understood their decision making, how to make decisions, and that people were being underserved and undersold in terms of product, service, but just a general understanding about how the brain works. And that's what I did for 4 years, and then took the business to market in early 2019, and so far it's been really good. And for me personally, it's been an amazing journey of 5 years, because you can't study all those things without becoming a lot more self-aware yourself and actually understanding everything about mental health, thinking, decision making, and purpose, really.
Amazing. Well, Martin, you won't mind me saying you're a very humble gentleman, and very, very kind-hearted and very generous. So you're probably humble enough not to acknowledge that you are a genius, but I'm telling you and our audience that you are a genius, and really looking forward to hearing some more insights from you. Could you tell us, what does mental health mean to you? And in your words, why should people do more about it?
It's such a deep question, right? The surface level response to me is that it's about your well-being. It's about the health that you put into your system, and a lot of that comes from how you think, and how we think comes from how we see the world and how the world treats us, and then how we perceive we're being treated, and it just goes on and on. I mean, your mental health is so directly connected to how you think. And obviously we've got a chemical and biological predisposition that we're born with. So if, for example, you inherit depression, which happens for a lot of people, it's manageable, but you can't necessarily get rid of it. Whereas anxiety tends to be something more that is a learned behavior, but generally because of how other people treat us. So, I mean, the depths of mental health just fascinate me. I've sat on the board of charities to do with trauma, which is something I'd love to talk about in this session, as well as charities to do with family support for addiction and things like that as well. So for me, mental health is it's a little bit of everything, because it's literally the lens of how you see life is the health that you create inside your mind.
Fantastic. Thank you, Martin, for sharing that. So thinking about, particularly those 4 years, really studying and learning, creating amazing stuff to then help the world around behavioral psychology and mathematics. Could you perhaps share some links that you can draw from that and into mental health, especially in some of the large organisations that you've been doing some amazing consulting projects for?
I think on the business side, I think most people don't understand their customers because they don't understand themselves as a general context about brands and things in general. And I'm not just talking about marketing, I'm not just talking about creativity. I'm just talking about the notion that, do we understand how we think as an individual, and therefore how others think? And most of the time what we're doing is just rebounding a version of how we see the world, and then going out, and without knowing it, that's the bias that we're putting out into other people. So we've had a lot of success just changing brand behavior, because we understand how to understand their marketplace, right? And how to change that about customers. That's the business side. So we've had a lot of success for that. On the personal side, I think the biggest thing that surprised me, that I'm still wrestling with to address inside myself and with others, is that your personality is not nature, it's nurture. It's an adaptive thing. It's something that can constantly change. And I think that we're still in a world where most people are told and educated that that's just how they are and who they are. And it creates a massive wall of resistance inside people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really good insights, Martin. Have you got any advice that you can share for the business leaders and other working adults in our community, in our network that are watching this video? How can they do more to support mental well-being in both themselves and others?
I think from the business point of view, on a practical level, if you have better mental health in your workforce, they're going to do more work, they're going to be more productive, they're going to be happier, they're going to believe more in what they're doing, and they're going to be more productive. That's what I still think the business world is built too much on he psychology. So he psychology is not a male-only domain, but is more dominant in men, and is the build of our society. And it tends to be more practical, more rational, more numbers focused, more tangible, right? Whereas mental health is intangible. It's hard to measure the impact of it, apart from somebody saying, I feel good. But productivity and everything else comes alongside it. I think in terms of tips for individuals and understanding what mental health is, for me, a lot of it is thinking patterns. Is if you don't think that your self-worth and your belief in self, if it's not high, that's not personality. That's not something you've inherited. It's something that has become a pattern for you. So you might have been bullied when you were a child, for example, right? And it creates a set of thinking habits that over time becomes harder and harder for you to deal with. It's why a lot of mental health peaks in a positive and a negative way once people get over the age of 40. Because it just compounds over all those years. And if you're not dealing with it, that's where breakdowns can come. And it's why breakdowns happen so often at that middle part of life, really.
Yeah, agree with you there, Martin. And for our listeners, it's also about we can think that we've got good mental health and that we're managing it and nurturing good mental health in ourselves and those around us. But it can be the unexpected that can make a busy work, a busy career, a busy life all too much all of a sudden. You know, a trauma, a divorce, a bereavement, a global pandemic, you know, bringing financial problems for many and so on. So I do think it's important that we continue to make it okay to talk about these concerns and worries and problems, and have each other's backs more as well, by looking out for each other. Martin, are there any good or bad experiences of mental health that you've had yourself that you'd feel comfortable sharing with us today?
Oh yeah, I had a massive breakdown. I'm talking about it like it's like I won a competition. Like I was the best. So what happened was a number of years ago, I was in a bar, had some people from my team just having a Friday night out, and I still to this day don't know what happened, but two guys in this bar attacked me. I was knocked unconscious. I was in hospital for 2 days, and it caused me to have a nervous breakdown. And that was, it was weird looking back now, because it was one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had in life. But if I had the choice, I obviously wouldn't have gone through it. But it did change the course of how I looked at life, and then by consequence, what I ended up doing in terms of those 4 years of study and everything that came with it. So that nervous breakdown was like, it was like an interesting traumatic, not interesting for the trauma, but interesting from like a scientific experiment. So I was like running two schools of thought the whole time I was going through the breakdown. One was like just observing myself and trying to understand what was actually going on a kind of science level. And the other one was just actually dealing with the trauma of what it was like. So it was quite a horrendous experience, really, and yet rewarding, which is weird.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, Martin. Of course, I'm sorry that you had to go through that. Are there any key things that come to mind in terms of how you pulled yourself out of that cycle, and how you got back to, you know, living a happier life, and in a positive way, you actually came out of that to, I would argue, you know, achieve some of your best successes in your career, you know, of your life so far?
I think to answer your question on a personal level for me is starting to study willpower and emotional intelligence, and weirdly reading Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill was a big trigger point for me, because I think that he's ultimately the godfather of positive thinking. It's not the secret or some esoteric thing. It's just a practical science about how the brain thinks. And if you read Think and Grow Rich, even though it was written in the 30s, he's really teaching you about positive mindset and how to think.
Mm.
So that was a big upside for me personally. It's something I still work on. One of my best buddies is an absolute master of it. And it's not about believing or thinking. This is what a lot of people think in society and why they reject it. It's not about being happy all the time. It's not about tricking yourself. You still run with all your emotions, but it's about the choices you make about how you think. And it's about really, for me, the ultimate goal in for anybody to do with their mental health should be self-belief.
Yeah.
Because when you believe in yourself, all that is associated with that on a biological level, on a chemical level, on a behavioral level, on a psychological level, all of it affects everything that you think, you feel, your chemical releases, your interactions with other people, the positive vibes that you put out. 70% of everything that we communicate is non-verbal. Like, it's just a killer combination of all those things.
Mm-hmm.
And then the more deeper part, which I was going to talk about, was this kind of idea of what trauma actually is. And you mentioned it yourself, right? Like, it's like the trauma of what's going on with the pandemic. It's different levels of trauma to everybody on the planet, which will never ever happen again, hopefully. But it's certainly, as far as I can tell, the first time that it's happened. And I've had this debate with people, and they've named things like SARS and global financial crisis and things like that, but that doesn't affect 100% of people. And World War II had an effect on the vast majority of people, but still not 100%. So I think this is the first time that we've all been through that. So there is a degree of trauma with it. Yeah. Would that be useful? If you want me to run through like my definition of why trauma is so difficult?
Yes, please. Thank you, Martin. I think that'd be excellent for our readers and listeners. Yeah.
Great. So I did a lot of work with this when I sat on the board of a charity that looks after trauma, as I mentioned earlier. The way that I describe trauma is I want you to imagine that, let's imagine that you're a human, any human, just an imagination game, right? And you're used to living your life the way that you do. So you get up, you go to your 9-to-5 job, you come home, you're happy, you play with your kids, you read a book, you've got some nice hobbies, you've got a wonderful relationship with your partner, everything's great. And then something absolutely horrendous happens to you. So we're talking about deep trauma. So it could be physical abuse, could be sexual abuse. Abuse is generally the biggest type of trauma, and it could be something that goes on for a long time until it reaches a breaking point with you. So some people get caught in a domestic abuse situation, and women's rights is something I've always worked a lot on. And eventually when they break free, what they're breaking free is they're escaping the house that they're in, right? But the trauma is still with them. And that person, what's happened to them is they've gone from the happy, regular way of thinking and habits and the way that they do it. And when they have the ultimate breakdown of trauma, it basically overrides all those thinking patterns inside your head. So let's imagine that your thinking patterns are like a schematic of all these lights kind of lighting up around the brain, right? And then you go through this trauma and all those lights get switched off, and it's like 100 miles of concrete get built on top of those set of thinking patterns. And trauma is so difficult. Why it takes years for people to recover from really bad, deep trauma is it's like you get given a pebble. This is how I describe it. And you know that it's going to be really difficult to get back to what you were. Might even be possible. And that's how people, impossible. And that's how people feel in trauma. But you've got this pebble and you start just clawing away at that concrete. And it can take you months, years for some people. I mean, the 4 stages of trauma can literally take years. But over time, they start to see little chinks of light, and they can start to see the lights and how things used to work, and they can start locking onto it. And then over time, they break free into more parts and they get rid of that concrete, and their thinking pattern comes back in and they can start to be normal again. And yet it's the slightest little triggers. It might be a smell, it might be a word that somebody uses. It can lock them back into that trauma. The concrete rebuilds, and then they've got to start eking away at it again. And it might not be 100 miles of concrete, it might not be 60 miles, but again, they've still got to go through that process. And I know it's a deep thing to describe, but I quite enjoy describing trauma like that. Not because I like trauma, but I think it's a good way for people to realize that trauma is the most difficult thing about trauma is not so much what happens in the moment of the trauma, it's actually the recovery after it. It's so difficult for people. And you can apply what I just said to not just to deep trauma, but to people being bullied. And bullying is something that drives me crazy because bullying works in so many different ways, and it happens in the workplace all the time. It's the human judgment thing. It's people wanting to be better than others. I had a friend that recently had this situation that because they had been employed for less than 2 years, they were getting bullied by somebody because there was no other reason than they were just jealous of them. And this person had been with the business for a long time, and it was a 25-person small business. And my friend got fired. And it was just heartbreaking because she hadn't done anything wrong other than this person didn't like the look of her, was just jealous of her. And because of the law, she didn't have any rights, and that gets into a little bit of injustice. But sorry, that's my rant about trauma, right? What do you think?
Oh, I think it's brilliant, Martin. And you know, personally, I've obviously been through various traumas, childhood bullying throughout my school life.
Right.
Also encountered bullying in my adult life as well. And I've also learned a bit over the years as well about how men can be victims of domestic abuse as well. It's not
Right.
just the women. And
Yeah.
this stuff can change you forever. And without the right help and support, and it can be that much harder to come back from it. But getting help and support is absolutely important. And I think, Martin, if we could probably summarize this section around sort of trauma actually quite nicely for our listeners by giving a few key tips, really. So I guess I'll put this to you initially, and I can add to it. For anyone who's listening who thinks that they perhaps have been through some kind of trauma or are perhaps going through one now, what would be the first 2 or 3 things they should do?
Well, the first thing is that you have to accept it and recognize that it's not a scale. So you don't have to be punched in the face once a day for 100 days to qualify for you having trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it can be one person saying a sentence to you that triggers lifelong things that you never realized, that are deep within your psyche that you just haven't accessed, right? So the reason why I say the punch in the face one is because it's a very man thing to say. And my advice is, particularly for men, is that it's okay to have emotions. It's okay to feel. I mean, it's 2020, and I still don't feel the world's moved on that forward, right?
No.
I mean, it was only 1993 that the International Center for Diseases, which is the global center for diseases, took being gay off of its list. 1993, right? So that wasn't even that long ago. I use that as an example because the world of science, the world of understanding, the world of society doesn't change that quickly. And we're still in this world where masculinity is such a taught behavior, and men on a very natural level find it much more difficult than women, again generalizing a little bit, but to talk about emotions and to feel free to do it. My advice about all of that is, whether you're a man or a woman, the longer that you don't speak about it, the harder it's going to be for you, because the biggest release that you get is the ability just to talk about it, whether that's with a partner or with therapy. And it depends, right? So I went through quite a difficult situation when my father passed away, and what I could see that my mum needed was some support from a third party. But saying that to somebody when they're grieving, particularly with their partner, is difficult, because what my mum wanted was my support, and I was still giving it to her. But what I was trying to coax her into was the fact that she needed that kind of support, and she did go to it eventually. But it was one of the big lessons for me, is that you can't make somebody or tell somebody to do something when they've gone through a trauma or difficult situation. They've got to accept that they're ready to do it. So the easiest thing for everybody to do is to accept that it's okay just to talk about it. And you can talk about anything in private with people that you love and trust. And that's always a good first step.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's good advice, Martin. And I think also for everyone listening, if you're in a good place, that's fantastic, and that's what we want for you and everyone around us.
Right.
But it's also being mindful that, for example, 1 in 4 working adults will go through some form of mental illness and poor mental health in the next 12 months. That was before coronavirus. So it could, I predict it's going to get a bit worse than that now. But the point being, if you're in a good place, fantastic. But there's a good chance that 1 in 4 people around you in your circle of influence, that's family, friends, business colleagues, business partners, customers, that they're going to go through some challenges as well. So for us all to be more aware of how to spot the signs of mental health issues, if that's trauma or anything, you know, and have each other's backs and offer support, and, you know, as I say, make it more normal and okay to talk about this stuff, and you know, it's part of life. We have to go through stuff, but it's much easier when we can get through stuff together and have support. And it's like everyone's vulnerable as well, Martin, right? It's not just that there's a traditional assumption that it's lower income populations that have that have more mental health issues, but it's statistically it's not. It can be low income populations, middle income, and high income.
It just manifests itself in slightly different ways, right? Depending on the environment. So you're absolutely correct.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Martin. So hindsight is a wonderful thing. Thinking back over your years, Martin, if you're going back, say, 10 or 20 years ago, what advice would you give to that slightly younger Martin Lucas about mental health?
I think that the challenge I always had, my kind of fraud syndrome, and part of the stuff that I took with me from childhood was the self-belief part.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize that on paper I was very successful from quite a young age, won a lot of awards, was leading salesperson, youngest person to get a senior leadership role in BT's corporate history by 4 years. Like I was a bit of a rock star as a kid and knew it as well. So what I exuded was quite arrogant confidence, but unknown to me, I was still carrying a lot of self-belief issues from when I was a kid. And that would generally manifest itself with me getting frustrated or feelings of anger in places where it just wasn't needed at all. And I wish that I've always lived life with having no regrets, right? One of my buddies and I always work on that basis, and that's difficult, not to have regrets with things. So I've never been one to say I'd love to go back and change this kid to do X, Y, and Z, because I believe that our path of life is our path of life, right? And it creates the experience and wisdom, and wisdom only comes from messing stuff up anyway. But I do wish that the one thing that I could tell that kid is that the self-belief is causing you not to follow what you believe is inside you, both in terms of talent, capability, learning, education, things that you deserved. So it was kind of like the voices from childhood, which was not me, affected the voices in my head as you go forward. And I don't mean voices in the head in a personality split issue, but you know what I mean? That is that kind of advice that I wish that I could give the kid. It's almost like being the dad to the kid, right? It's just giving them some fatherly advice that says, stop hiding stuff, stop hiding your emotions, that it's okay not to believe in yourself, but that's not your fault. And you are good at this, so go and do more of it. That's the thing I would like to do.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Martin, for sharing that. We're just about out of time today, and I know you're a very busy man who's in demand, Martin, so I appreciate the time you spent. Any final advice you'd like to share with our audience? If there's anyone who's watching who might be concerned about their own mental health, or maybe they're thinking about concerns they have over a colleague, a teammate, a friend, family member, any final advice you'd give to them?
The one thing that I'll give to everybody is there's a thing called the 4 Agreements, and it was created by a group called the Toltecs, and they were around at the same time as the Aztecs, so many centuries ago, right? And the 4 Agreements is it was a set that they all lived by, which was about how they treated one another as individuals, right? And I would take anybody, please write it down, put it into some kind of system. Like I've got an app that saves me daily reminders, and I've been doing this for years about the 4 Agreements. And here's why: because the 4 of them are: be impeccable with your word. Difficult, right? So just it's like most of the time when somebody's having an argument with you or being mean to you, they're dealing with their own crap and they don't know how to deal with it. So our ability not to take it personally and just to wash it off is difficult, but that's what contentment is inside, really. Number 2 of the 4 Agreements is don't take things personally, right? So again, most of the time when you listen to somebody saying something, they're just rebounding their own negative version of things. So I find that some advice from humans is good. A lot of advice from humans is just about their own limitations. So you've got to look at the wisdom of what that looks like. Number 3 is don't make assumptions. Very common for humans to make assumptions. It's part of our setup inside of our brain. But if you make assumptions and you don't challenge yourself, then you're just going to keep believing what you think is the case, and that's going to affect your mental health. And the 4th one is always do your best. So they're really, really simple, but incredibly powerful. And the more that you can get them into your system and it becomes a mnemonic and a habit and things like that, I guarantee you that you're purposely positively managing your mental health before it becomes an issue. So I'm a big advocate for the 4 agreements.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martin. And just to check my understanding of that, what we're talking about here, in other words, is training the brain or rewiring the brain into a more positive mindset, something that a mindset that's more resilient, happier, and in turn, it's great mental health drives better productivity, better life happiness,
right,
and improved results. With that, would you agree with that?
Yeah, and everybody deserves good mental health. Right, full stop.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about, in the world today, we think about mental health too often. Society presents it, and this is why I love what you're doing, Daryl. So society presents it as mental health is only an issue when it's a problem. Whereas actually, you can find the life that you, as an individual, deserve by managing your mental health and managing how you think, because it's all about how you go out into the world and the lens that you see it with, because we all see the world differently, and everybody's got an opportunity to train themselves, to train their brain, to take the most out of life, because it's a short life. This is what the pandemic's shown us. It's a short life, so who do you want to be and what do you want to get from it? And that's where positive mental health comes into it, I think.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Martin. I think it's like society does take a while to change, not just society, but businesses.
Right.
So we talked a bit earlier about how it was only 1993 when gay came off the register and started to become more acceptable and more normalised. But there's still issues. There's still discrimination,
of course,
and that we're still dealing with racism around skin color. But it's better than it was, and I'm predicting a similar trend around mental health. We're talking about it more. There's more awareness, which is great. Some companies are leading the way with doing more to nurture great mental health for their staff, and they're seeing growth results and improved staff retention and other key return on investment as well. But like on a personal level, many of us have invested before in personal trainers, and we work on our physical fitness, our physical body shape. And what I'm predicting is that there will be a time where everyone, for instance, has a mental fitness trainer, and everyone is specifically being proactive to drive greater mental fitness in themselves and those around them. And we're still a bit of a way away from that, but having great people like yourself, Martin, flying the flag and supporting with raising awareness is a big step forward. So thank you very much, Martin, for giving us your time today and your wisdom. And I really wish you well for the future. And obviously, we'll be keeping in touch, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Brilliant. Thanks, Daryl. Keep fighting the fight.
Yeah, and you. Thank you, Martin.